Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Happy Mother's Day. If you are a mother, we are so thankful for you. Literally, we would not be here without you in so many cases. But as we celebrate a day like this, we're also very aware of all of the nuances that come around a day. Some of you are maybe going through Mother's Day the first time without somebody at the table this year, or this reminds you of a painful thing that you've been journeying through, a miscarriage or childlessness, or maybe even a mother that wasn't maybe what that mother should have been to you. And so in the midst of the joy of this day, we recognize that it's complicated for some of us. And the good news is that in all of those complications and all of those cracks and those spaces in between, God is with us. And the Spirit of God is with us. And so I pray for those of you who feel that way, and I am one of those people, having lost my own mom fairly early in my life, that you would both navigate the tension of the celebration and the things that it brings up in your life, and know that God is with you in that. One more quick announcement before we get into our next edition of The Stretch. There is a congregational meeting that will be coming up in a couple weeks on May the 26th. That is for two matters concerning our property at 30 Roscoe in Madison. We are putting up that to a vote as to whether we should sell that property or not, and also some work we need to do on the boilers. Very exciting stuff. But those are posted around the building. It's in the program. Some of you are like, hey, that's Memorial Day weekend. What gives? As you've noticed, we have a bunch of stuff going on in the life of our church, and trying to get this all scheduled, sequenced, and timed is a challenge for us. And so we'll be having that meeting that day, but you also have the opportunity, if you're a member of Long Hill Chapel, you can vote absentee. You can request a ballot. There are ballots at the Welcome Center. We will send you one. We will email you one. If you are a member, you can vote that way. We are, after this service, going to have a very brief, and by brief I mean I will not even sit down brief, Q&A session for those of you who might not be able to be here on the 26th, who just want to find out some more information. Based on our last meeting, there are a couple of things we explored, and we have some information to follow up with that. I'd like to get that into your hands. But that information will also be presented on May 26th at the meeting. So if you're going to be at the meeting, you'll get it there. But if you're not and you'd like to talk to me and Tom, one of our elders, will be there over in the fellowship hall immediately after church. We're not sticking around because I've got a brunch appointment, but I would be happy, and I would like to stay married. That would be great. But we are here to try to just give you the information that you need. Also, that meeting, we will have a private live stream link we'll put out in the program for you. And the idea is just so you can have access to it if you want to stay connected to it for the purposes of transparency and making sure we go forward together. So all of those things will be over there, informal question and answer, a couple follow-ups from the last one of those, and then that meeting will actually be on the 26th. So we've been in a series. It's called The Stretch, and it's the simple idea that I won't go into deeply, that all of the best things in your life, they involve a stretch. They involve a stretch from where you were to somewhere where you're not, and that stretch is always uncomfortable. If it were easy, we would do it all the time. But any stretch we make in our lives, it involves a level of discomfort. My son's a baseball player. We love playing catch. He loves pitching to me. And I'm 47 years old, and I was not a baseball player. And I threw way too many baseballs yesterday. And so this arm isn't working all that well. It's because I didn't stretch beforehand. And so the best things in your life involve a stretch. And last week we looked at the stretch we feel as people in relationships between giving and receiving grace with each other and speaking truth with each other. This is a complicated thing, and it's not just in our Christian relationships, it's in all of our relationships. It's in your marriage, it's in the relationship you have with your children, with your friends, with the people that you encounter on a day-to-day basis, and it's also in how we are as a church and how we kind of go forward as a church together. We talked about the fact that grace and truth are kind of like these two foundations. They're like these two pillars that hold everything else up. They hold up love, literally, and love is the thing that holds grace and truth together. We give grace because we love, and we speak truth because we love. But those two things seem like they're opposites of each other, but they're actually two sides of the same coin. Any good relationship that is truly built on love has both grace and it has truth in it. And this is a tension that we feel. Some of you are in a situation right now where you know you need to have a conversation with somebody, and you don't want to have the conversation because it's awkward. because there's something that needs to get out on the surface that's inside, and it's uncomfortable to do it. If you didn't care so much, you wouldn't have the conversation. You would just go have the conversation and say the thing. On the other hand, there's some of us who, we've been trying to live in truth. We've been trying to speak truth, and it seems like it's just not connecting with the other person. There's this tension we feel between these two things, and what happens is we're tempted to resolve it in one direction or the other. Each of us is by our nature. Some of us we love confrontation, we love telling the truth. And some of us would love to never have that. We would rather crawl under a rock than have that kind of difficult conversation. And so we're tempted naturally to go one way or the other. But the problem is when you go all in one direction or the other direction with this thing, it falls apart. It literally stops working. It doesn't work anymore. And it goes something like this. There was a quote that we ended with last week that we printed in the program last week because several of you asked for it. It was on the slides by a pastor in Australia named Richard P.W. Tan. And he said this. He said, "Grace without truth is not really grace, and truth without grace is not really truth. So you need both to have both. Grace without truth pampers, truth without grace hammers. Grace without truth is love without correction. So it's feeling and saying a thing, but it's never really getting to the heart of the issue. Truth without grace is correction without love. Grace without truth is mercy without justice. And truth without grace is justice without mercy." And one of the things we realize about God is that God is 100% mercy to us, and he's 100% justice. That's why this gets so complicated, because he can't just let things slide, but he's also full of mercy and full of grace. And that's why Jesus came to fulfill that tension between justice and mercy for us. Grace without truth is soft and spoils people. If you have some kids, you know that that's true. Truth without grace is harsh and it crushes people. Grace without truth is freedom without responsibility, and truth without grace is responsibility without freedom. Either extremes are neither of Christ nor of the gospel. Now, here's where this gets complicated, because I think we mostly agree with this. Nobody walked out when I said this about grace and about truth. It gets tricky because a relationship that is imbalanced one way or the other can work when things are going well. It can work when things are going well. Some of you have a relationship with somebody, and there's kind of these eggshells that you walk on because you don't want to upset things. And as long as things are okay, you can kind of imbalance in the direction of grace, or even imbalance in the direction of truth, and things can kind of work themselves out. But what happens is all of our relationships have times where they're difficult. They have times where they're challenging. For the church in America, it was easy for us to talk about Jesus and talk about grace and truth when, at least around us in a respectable company, it looked like most people even if they weren't church people or Christian people, they believed most of the same things, and they had an understanding that was similar to ours. Increasingly, in a culture that's kind of going in a different direction, we run into the limits of that, and this becomes really important. And I think we've seen both examples. Looking around, we've seen people say, it's all great. Jesus loves everybody and you can do whatever you want. And then there's the people who, just really make a big noise and are literally oppressive in the name of truth. And what happens is when things start to go in a difficult direction, there's something that we tend to do. We tend to always and never people. You always or you never. And so we kind of put people in these groups. We put people in these classifications. We say, you're not an individual anymore with nuance and a story. You fit into this group over there. Think about all the categories that you have in your life, or the categories that the world around us, or that politics, or that the news cycle have tried to define for us. There's political groups. There's the people who are in that agree with me, and then there's all those other people who are literally from the devil. They're literally trying to destroy us all, and both sides think that about each other. Amazing how that works. But there's moral groups, there's social groups, there's groups in our society that we look at and we're tempted to assign blame for everything to. Like all the bad things are because of that group of people. We do this, we put people into categories because it instinctively allows us to turn our brains off. And so when you're tempted to go to somebody and say, you're this kind of person, this is what you always do, this is who you always are, this is the nefarious, evil, bad thing that you're trying to accomplish, check yourself. Because you're putting someone in a box that may not be their box. It allows us to turn our brains off, but it also allows us to dehumanize people. And maybe it's even someone you don't know. It's those people over there who are doing that thing that I don't agree with. And we all have a list of groups that we could put into that category depending on where we find ourselves on the social spectrum. And it's easy to say, those people, that's what they always do. Those people are coming here for our jobs. Those people are trying to redefine sexuality. Those people, and my challenge to you would be, have you ever sat across the table from one of those people and had a conversation with them? Not your preconception of them, but them. Have you ever sacrificed for one of those people? Because what I've found in my own life, and I have countless stories of this, is it's easy to think about an issue and put faces on the issue, but then when you encounter the person and you get closer to the person, it gets much more challenging to keep that up. It gets much more challenging to those people, that particular issue or that box that you put people in. Here's where I'm going with this. Jesus didn't just come for groups and boxes. He came for individuals. He came for you. And he came for me. And he died. It says God so loved the world, but that wasn't like the impersonal, unknown world. That was God so loved the world that he gave his only son for you and for every one of those people. Every single one of them. So Jesus died for you, but Jesus died for the person you don't think deserves Jesus. Jesus died for the group of people who you think are so hopelessly without hope. He came to be hope. And so this is the problem that we have, is that we cannot do that. We can't just paper over things and assign people to categories. Our love for the other people that God has made in his image must be deeply personal and individual for it to be love like Jesus. And if you want to really mess with your categories, go find someone who fits one of them and take them out to lunch or have a real conversation, not where you're trying to win the argument conversation, but actually a real conversation with them. And you'll find a lot of nuance that is totally going to mess with your idea of who those people are. And you know what, friends? The other thing is this. There are other people who think you're one of those people. There's other people who think that we in this room are one of those people. And so the way we break this cycle with the love of Jesus is by breaking out of those boxes and being incredibly individual. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of things, there are a lot of situations you can't do much about, but there's someone, I need to move the stool back. There's somebody in your life that God has put there to be the place that you start. And so maybe all you need to get from what I'm saying today is to start with that person and allow the Holy Spirit to saturate the conversation. I believe truly, friends, if we did that as a church, this would be a very different looking place. This would be a very different looking community. It might even be a very different looking world. I want you to visualize a picture in your mind. I had a closet in my last house, and it had a rack, and it had that has the bar that you hang all the stuff on. I enjoy going to TJ Maxx and buying button-up shirts. This one actually came from there, I think. But when I'm having a bad day, there's nothing like a cheap TJ Maxx shirt that makes me feel better. And my wife, Grace, is here somewhere, and she knows that I'm probably almost into triple digits with cheap button-up shirts from TJ Maxx. I have some good shirts too, but there's nothing that's like, man, I'm having a bad day, I'm gonna go buy a $15 shirt. And so I have so many of these things, and when I get my dry cleaning back, we hang them on the bar, and there was in our last house, and the whole thing literally just collapsed. The whole bar in the closet collapsed. And so I want you to go into this quote that I'm about to say, or this statement I'm about to say, with that image in mind. Any truth that you want to hang love on requires love to be strong enough to hold it up. It requires love to be strong enough to hold it up. It didn't matter how expensive or how nice or how in fashion or how out of fashion my shirt collection was. It didn't matter that they were clean and that they came back from the dry cleaners. If the bar doesn't hold them up and it collapses into a pile, it's not worth much. If our love cannot hold up our truth, it does not matter how good our truth is. If our love can't hold it up, it doesn't matter how good it is. And it actually just ends up in a pile on the ground, and it's useless and it's meaningless and nobody can experience. And here's the thing that's tricky about this when it comes to love. This isn't how we feel we're doing. This is how the other person experiences us. You know, for love to be experienced as love, it has to be seen as love by the other person. You know, I can do all sorts of things in the name of love that I see inside my mind, but how that other person is experiencing that may or may not be love. You have to have a strong enough relationship. You have to have a strong enough bar to hold that up. And some of you are saying, you know, there's these times where you have to do and say difficult things when it comes to love, and you're absolutely right. What you're doing in that moment, if you're doing that, is you're committing yourself to the long haul. You're not just coming in and dropping the truth bomb and leaving and going on with your life. You're saying, I am doing and I'm saying this difficult thing. I'm making this difficult move, but I'm going to show up for everything that's going to happen after it for the long haul. It's going to be costly. It's going to be frustrating at times, but I'm here because I want this to eventually be seen and experienced as love. It's something that takes a long time. And so for us to do that, what we give as love has to be received as love in order for it to be love. And sometimes that is a difficult thing, but it's followed by something that makes it clear. And I forget who said this. They said, you know, love sometimes it starts sharp, it starts hard, but it ends sweet. It always ends sweet. That's how you know you have love. And if our love can't hold up our grace, then our grace is cheap. Think about how Jesus gave, how much grace he gave us and how much it cost him. Grace is such a costly thing. And so Jesus, we quoted that passage from John chapter 1 last week where it says, Jesus came from the Father full of grace and full of truth, 100%. It was this singular thing. It's this tension that we talked about, that we managed. And for the rest of our time, I want to get our way through a passage that some of you have heard in the church before. And I want to do it in context because it's very easy for us to kind of pluck a section out of the Bible and make it say whatever we want it to say. And this is a passage that is found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18. And it's about confrontation. It's about how we work out love when it comes to grace and it comes to truth. And Jesus, in this passage, is talking to his closest followers, and by extension, he's talking to us. Beginning in Matthew 18, verse 12, Jesus says this, "What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly, I tell you, he is happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off." So this tells us something about how God is, how God operates. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any one of these little ones should perish. If you look at this from a pure economic standpoint, you look at it like, I have 100 sheep and one of them is lost and now I have 99 sheep. You still have a lot of sheep. If you look at this from just a very practical standpoint, it's like, okay, I lost one. It doesn't seem like it makes sense to go chase after the one. But this tells us something about who God is. This tells us something about how God views us. This tells us something about how God views the world. And this also tells us something about how God views those other people that are in your life. So it doesn't say, the sheep wandered off and the father went on a crusade against sin. He went out and he stood for stuff. He fought a culture war in the world around us. It's about restoring what was lost. In order for there to be something that needs to be restored, there must have been beauty and value for what was lost. You know, if the father in this little parable is like, yep, 100 sheep, 99, still pretty good, it's a rounding error. But instead, he goes off and he pursues the sheep. And here's the other thing I want you to get. In that culture, a wealthy landowner, someone who would have owned a bunch of sheep and animals and land and farm and all of those things, they would have subcontracted this. They would have delegated this down. They've said, hey, I've got all these people working for me. You go find the sheep. But instead, the owner goes off and he goes out and finds the sheep. You cannot outsource this. You cannot miss this. And you cannot do that in your life with the relationships that fit into this category. God cares so much about this with humanity, he's willing to go to extreme lengths and great personal cost to recover it. You know, it's not God who lost the sheep wandered off. And that's who we are as people. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, says the words of the old hymn. We are just prone to do that. If you've ever watched sheep, you know, they just kind of go in all directions out to the boundaries of wherever they are. But we have a Father, we have a loving Heavenly Father who pursues us. Even when it's our sin that has broken the relationship, our Father pursues us. And we, friends, are called to do the same with each other. So this is the context. This is why I want to give you the context for what comes next. Verse 15. This is that passage about confrontation. If your brother or sister, look at the relationship there, your brother or your sister, not those other people, your brother or your sister sins, go and point out their fault, just the two of you. This is intentional language. It's about relationship. This isn't like, you know, you go and you find some random passersby and you tell them all the things they're doing wrong. If your brother or sister, remember what I said about love, in order for truth to work, love has to be able to hold it up. There's something that's been built there. There's a level of trust. There's a level of investment. And there's a level of understanding that allows this to work. And if that's not there, it does not work. I can tell you that this is one of these clobber passages that's used very often in the church and in the Bible, where we just go confront people and tell them where they're wrong. I can tell you all the ways it doesn't work. The only way it does work is if the relationship is there that makes the pursuit worthwhile. And so a good thing for you to ask when you want to go confront somebody on a thing that you think they should be doing differently is ask and answer this question. For me, is this more about the relationship or about the issue? Is this about restoring something that's valuable, or is this about me winning the issue, making the point, showing who's right and who's wrong? Because healthy versions of stepping into this are always about the relationship. It's always about saying, you know, I have a lot of relationships, but I value this one so much, just like the 99 sheep and the one sheep, that I'm willing to take the risk. I'm willing to put in the effort. I'm willing to make the investment. I'm not going to delegate this down or delegate this out. I'm going to do something about this. Unless you have that true value for the relationship, this whole thing, it's not going to start from the right place, and it won't end well. He goes on, if they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter, this is a quote, may be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. So this is mostly about relationships that we have in here. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector. And I think it's easy for us to read that and say, hey, they're out, bye. How did Jesus treat pagans and tax collectors? When you read the gospel accounts, how did Jesus treat them? He pursued them. He never stopped pursuing them. He was very aware that they weren't in the same kingdom as he was, but he pursued them in a way that was scandalous to the religious people around them. What if we were known as people who went to such great lengths that the people around us said, what are you people doing? Why are you wasting your time? And so think about that. How would Jesus do that? Even when things don't go well, even when there's something that's not resolved. Would Jesus give up? He would understand that there's a boundary between the kingdom that they're in and the kingdom that he is in, but he would not give up that issue. And so Jesus goes on in verse 18, he says, "Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Truly, again, I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven." This is one of those confusing things that Jesus says, but what he's saying is there's such power in unity before God. There is such power that when we can get ourselves onto the same page before God, it's absolutely worth it. And then there's this famous verse that we take out of context all the time in verse 20, "For where two or three gather in my name, there I am with them." And so this is about fighting for restoration, preserving relationships, doing the hard work even when it doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense, and it's costly. So there's this progression here. We were talking about grace and truth earlier. Think about how it works. In verse 15, there's kind of a lot of grace and there's some truth. There's always both. There's never just one or just the other. So it's just the two of you together. But then in verse 16, it's you bring someone with you to say, there's this truth that you're not really seeing, that you're not really hearing. And so I want to attempt with someone else to establish some objective reality with you. And then it kind of goes over more in the direction of truth. When you're saying, hey, we have more people who see the same thing that you're not seeing. And then there's this thing that happens at the end of verse 17 where it's like you treat them, you say, we're not in the same kingdom anymore. There's a boundary that gets put up. Think about this. I thought about doing a little demonstration up here, but I realized for those of you who are like over in Madison in the back of this room, by the way, across the street is Madison and it is Chatham on this side. You guys are almost in Madison, all the way 100 feet away. If I do props, it's very hard for anyone to see it in the back, so I decided not to do props, so I'm asking you to do the same thing that I asked my 9-year-old to do, which is to use the power of your imagination. Can we use the power of our imagination? Imagine a bridge that's held up by two pillars. It's a bridge like the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, if you've ever seen that one in New York City. It's this long span, and there's these two columns that hold the whole bridge up. Grace and truth are kind of like pillars. If you don't have one of them, the bridge falls down. We've learned a little bit about bridges falling down when it comes to the news. But those are the two pillars that hold this bridge of a relationship that's built on a healthy version of love up. And when those two pillars are the same length, the bridge is even, it's level, you can navigate any condition in it, you can drive straight through it. But imagine what happens when the pillars begin to be different lengths. Imagine like if the grace pillar is super high and the truth pillar is super low, you have this incline that happens. In relationships that are high grace and low truth, people can coast in the relationship downhill to you. And when conditions get slippery, when things aren't going well, what happens when you slide down a hill and there's somebody at the bottom of a hill? There's a wreck. You run into them. I grew up in upstate New York. Some of you are tired of me saying that I grew up in upstate New York, where it snows all the time. I remember when I started driving, I lived in this little town, and there was this one road that we would go down, and I would go to it to go over to the church that I was part of, and it had an incline on it, and I had driven that road many, many times just perfectly fine when conditions were dry and sunny. I'm still learning to drive. We have a snowstorm that has some of the snow freezes to ice in that hill going down the hill. I went down the hill, I slid completely through the intersection. I just put on the brakes, nothing happened. I kept going, my car flipped around and I just sailed through the intersection, finally stopped and went on my way. Thankfully, nobody was coming through the intersection at that point. What changed? The hill was still there, but things got slippery. And so some of you have relationships with other people where they're high grace, they're low truth, and it kind of works, like we said in the beginning, when things are dry. But when things start to get slippery, there's people who are constantly bumping into you, and you're asking yourself the question, why do I keep getting bumped into? Why do people keep sliding into me? It's because they're sliding down that hill of those imbalanced pillars of grace and truth. But think about the opposite, where you have low grace and high truth. In this case, people have to climb uphill to get to you. They have to climb uphill to get to where you are. Some of you have a relationship like that where you know if you just behave exactly right, you don't cause any problems, you toe the line, you can stay up there. But again, when conditions get slippery, what begins to happen? You can't stay up the hill any longer. And so a high truth, low grace relationship, people are sliding backwards constantly and they're clawing their way back and they're trying to get there. But when those two pillars are in balance with each other, when you are giving and receiving grace, but you're also able to speak the truth, truly in love, you can navigate any condition even when you have to take it slow. So there's grace, then there's truth, but then there's this other thing, this other word that we see at the very end of the passage about boundaries. We often get the order wrong with this. Very often when somebody, there's some slippery thing in the relationship, we go right to boundaries, say, you're out, I'm leaving, they're leaving, get out, I'm not coming back. That's not what this passage teaches us to do. It teaches us that we get to that point when we realize that we're not in the same kingdom. We've done all the things that we can possibly do, but we're not in the same kingdom anymore. And what it really is something like this, it's saying something like this: your understanding of what is true, right, and real in this relationship is fundamentally different than mine. We cannot navigate together anymore, even when it's slow. Some of you are saying, when do I know how to do that? When is it time for that? Here's when it's time for that. It is time for a boundary when you've done the grace truth thing in the ways that we've just outlined. You've done it by yourself. You've done it with someone who is mutually trusted. You've brought some objective reality in and it's still not going anywhere. At that point, it's time to say, it might be time to put a boundary in this relationship. And you especially know it's time to do that when your soul, the thing that God has given you, the uniqueness of who you are, it is in danger of being damaged or destroyed or used or even abused. Boundaries protect what's valuable, and they also, get this is going to sound weird, they create pain. Boundaries create enough pain, not for the purposes of being vindictive or inflicting pain on others, but to get the other person's attention. It's kind of like when some of you, we have kids and we say, that thing that you had as a privilege, you don't get that thing anymore. If you do that from a vindictive standpoint, you should probably check yourself. But what you're doing is you're trying to communicate with them in a way that they understand, that gives just enough pain so that it gets their attention for what's true. Think about boundaries like the guardrails that we have on the highway. There's some places like out on Route 78 where there's a steep incline on both sides of the highway and there's a guardrail at the edge of the highway. Why is that guardrail there? It's so you hit the guardrail and it will damage your car and it will make some noise, but it will protect you from what is beyond it that is far worse. It's far worse than that. I remember when they put those rumble strips in. Those things have saved me late at night when I've been very tired more times than I can count. But it's designed to get your attention. And so sometimes we do that because sometimes the only way that people respond is to a level of discomfort, of pain that is supposed to get their attention. And so this whole thing is about restoring the relationship. It's not about evening the score. It's not about inflicting pain. It's about restoring the relationship. And so really what Jesus is saying here is he's saying there's real power. Just like that thing at the end, whether 2 or 3 of you agree in something in my name, there I am in the midst of it. There's real power in our relationships when they're centered on Jesus. They literally have the power to change us, to change others, and to change the world. We're not done with the passage yet. Don't worry, I'm mostly just going to read this because all of you have brunch reservations that you need to get to. Verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, here's another famous passage that we kind of take separately. It's in the same group as all this other stuff. Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Peter thinks he's being super generous here. It's like, I'm going to forgive them 7 times. How generous I am. And in Jewish culture and Jewish understanding, that number 7 was the same number as perfection. It meant, that's the perfect way to do it. But Jesus raises the stakes for him and for us. And it shows us just how committed we have to be to this thing. Jesus answered, verse 22, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. And that's not like a literal number. You get the 76, 77, I'm done, I'm out. It's saying that this is something we need to stick with for the long haul. We need to not clock ourselves out of this process. We need to not do the same for other people. We need to, friends, as the church in the world, when the world around us is starting to look just a little bit scary, when it's looking difficult, when there's people and issues and things that are complicated that seem threatening to us, we don't get the opportunity to withdraw. We lean in with the power of God through the power of the Holy Spirit, and we see each person, not in the boxes that we've made for them, but as the unique, beloved creation made in the image of God, that we are called to be Jesus to, even when it seems like they don't agree with what we would like them to agree with. And to illustrate this, Jesus tells, as he often does, another story. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven, how it is in God's economy, is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold, that's a lot of bags of gold. The idea here is this is a debt that could not possibly be repaid, was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. So Jesus, in telling this story, is setting something up. He's saying this is how we are before God. We have a debt created by sin that we could not pay. But in Jesus, God cancels that debt, and he lets us go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants, so this is the servant who's had his debt canceled, who owed him 100 silver coins, a much smaller debt. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell on his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I'll pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told the master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owes. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Happy Mother's Day. But this is a story. A parable is a story that is told in language that we understand so that it makes a point. Friends, whether you realize it or not, some of you, whether you remember it or not, you have been forgiven much. The grace of God has been poured into your life and into my life and into our lives, and that should fundamentally change how we approach every single other person made in the image of God. The ones who are easy to like, the ones who are hard to like, the ones who agree with us, the ones who don't. It should change fundamentally how we go into the world. So this practical application of how to do this is sandwiched in between these two stories, the sheep, the 99 and the 1, and the master and the servants, to remind us about how God does this with us and for us, and how then we ought to do with each other. We've been given grace, and we need to receive grace. We've been given the truth about us, and we need to receive it. But Jesus built the bridge that we can cross. But in the same way, it is how we do the same for everyone else, our brothers and our sisters. It's something we must build, rebuild, pursue, keep going, and restore. So today, who in your life do you need to work on your bridge with? The bridge of grace and truth. Let's pray together.